Good morning to everybody. An interesting experience for me, working remotely, which I've been doing for the past 6 months, as I'm sure many of you have. In this particular situation, I'm used to giving a presentation at a conference and I can see any number of people in the room. So I'm not quite sure how many of you have made the decision to join me, but if you have, then thank you for doing so. And my name is Geoff CARTER, and it is my opportunity now in the next 30 minutes to talk you through the background to the new EFQM model and why it is the way it is. And if we have the time at the end, I'll be happy to take some questions from you as well. Having said what my name is, i.e. Geoff CARTER, probably the other positioning statement I should make as to why me here now talking about the EFQM model is because I had the opportunity and the pleasure and the challenge of leading a core team of people to develop the new EFQM model, transitioning from the old 2013 model, which is obviously, as the date suggests, is now 7 years old. So I'd like to share with you a few slides which will talk to you about the high-level structure of the model, why we made the decisions that we did. If we could move to the next slide, please. Okay, thank you. Next slide. So I want to talk about why updating the model and give you an overview of the development process that we went through, the journey as it was called, share with you some key messages to emerge from the development process, what is the design concept of the model, and the structure and key themes of the new model as well. So obviously it is only a 30-minute session, so we can't drill down into the minutiae, but I hope to try to give you the headline points that will help you to better understand this new EFQM model. If we can go to the next slide, please. I came across this quote last week as I was preparing for this presentation. I'm sure many, if not all of you, are aware of Fortune magazine, and every year they hold a global forum to which the great and the good are invited to offer their pearls of wisdom. And this one caught my eye. On the speed of change, this whole circle of change is coming faster and closer. The real differentiator of us as leaders is being able to navigate change. And that came from Barbara Humpton, the CEO of Siemens in the USA. And it resonated with me because that was very much what came out of the research that we went through when we were developing this latest version of the model. I'll say a little bit more about it when we go through the picture of a funnel that I'll share with you. But I just really wanted to put this up front in the sense of, before we get into the detail of the model and how it's structured, it is really, I wanted to spend a couple of minutes with you on the context, why it is the way it is, and what do we get out of the research project. And it was very much about managing the whole change process and the rate of change. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So I just want to talk you through briefly with the next slide that will follow on the journey that took us from the 2013 model to this new one, and why we've ended up where we are. So if you go to the next slide, please. So here's a picture that I use to talk people through the process. I think the thing to emphasize here, the purpose of the slide, is to try to convey to the viewers, the listeners, the rigor and robustness of the process. It was a year, an intense 12-month period between June 2019 that took us through to 2018 that took us through to June 2019, and then leading up to the launch in the forum a few months later. And there were a variety of inputs. We had a survey that we sent out, to which we were very happy, although it was a mountain of analysis. We were very happy to receive over 1,200 responses to that survey. We already had a community of practice, an EFQM community of practice set up that was looking at what are the mega trends that are coming over the horizon. And we used the outcomes from that community of practice to also help us. And we held a workshop with about 60 to 70 people at the forum in Vienna the previous year in 2018, basically to pick their brains and also to test with them what our thinking was at that time. And it was at that workshop that people will have heard for the first time that it was the view of the core team, based on the research they'd already done, that this change to the model would be at the revolutionary end of the spectrum rather than the evolutionary. And certainly the one thing that heartened me when I was invited and given the opportunity to lead the team was to receive the reassurance from the EFQM management team that I had a blank sheet of paper. I was not going to be constrained by whatever changes we felt were relevant had to be fitted within the existing 9 boxes. And so that workshop was the first time where we started to signal that we were talking about some significant changes. Obviously, none of this happens without the support of the EFQM board, and so they were all kept up to date through the whole process and gave us the agreement to go to each successive stage. You'll see also there it talks about EEA winners. That was what used to be called the EFQM Excellence Award. So there were some interviews with recent winners. There was an awful lot of desktop research, and I'll share with you one of the books that we used, that I used to help structure my own thinking at the end of this session. And of course, we had the existing model, the 2013 model. I don't know how many of you listened to the plenary the discussion yesterday with Russell, Longmuir, Yilmaz and Martin talking about the model, but you will have heard during that conversation the comment made that although it was time to upgrade and update the model, it didn't mean that everything in the existing model was bad. Quite the opposite. And indeed, if you were part of that session yesterday, you would have heard Martin respond to my question when I said to him, as a previous user of the model, the 2013 version, and transitioning to the new model, what did he think the split was in the sense of what could he bring forward from the old model to the new one? And he sort of felt there was like a 60 to 40% ratio of old versus new. So we have this English expression, I'm sure that you have your equivalents, which is you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So there was a lot of good stuff in the 2013 model, and it wasn't completely thrown onto the scrap heap. But the one I want to come back to for a moment is the input at the top where you'll see it says C-suite. Everything was important in terms of this research project, but perhaps the C-suite interviews were the most informative in the sense of their views of the world and what needed to change and what were the challenges they faced. And in fact, the question that we asked we had over 60 C-suite interviews, and in every C-suite interview, the question we asked was, what keeps you awake at night? And out of that, we came up with what effectively is one of the criteria in the model, which is managing two sides of the same coin. It is managing today's business whilst looking to the future. So this whole driving performance and transformation really came out of those C-suite interviews very strongly. There are a number of workshops that the core team held. I won't particularly go into the detail of those and the dates, etc. The other two things I would want to share with you here is the fact that we went through a development testing phase in April and May. We had, I think from memory, 24 different organisations who tested the model for us and gave the core team their feedback. And obviously we went through then an iteration of, based on the feedback we'd got, to make the final adjustments. The other thing that I would just like to point your focus to is you'll see at the bottom of the funnel, you'll see it says EFQM Model 2020, English language version, 28th of June 2019. And the reason why I put the 2020 in and I put it in red is because this is not the EFQM Model 2020. I'm very passionate and very clear that this is the latest version of the model, and we absolutely do not date stamp it with 2020. So if you'd like to keep me happy, please don't call it the 2020 model. And the reason for that is when we had the 2013 model, and here I am in 2018, something like that, trying to persuade organisations that the EFQM model is good for them, they turn around to me and say, "But Geoff, why should I be interested in a model that's 6 or 7 years old?" So please, if you're passionate about EFQM and you love the model and you want organisations to use it, don't handicap yourself by calling it the 2020 model, because in 2 years' time you will face that same challenge, because people will be wanting to use something that they think is current, relevant and fit for the future. So just a little personal plea from me on that one. Okay, if we can go to the next slide, please. So the key messages to emerge from the development process, I've already given you an indication of one of them, which came from the C-suites about what keeps them awake at night, but let's just look at a few of the others now. So please move on to the next slide. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I have 3 slides on this section. This one, which talks about the outside-in view, then I'll share with you a visual, and then we'll have another slide that's text-based that talks about the more internal view. But in terms of the research outcomes that guided the model, starting with the outside-in view, the world has changed considerably and very quickly, and I think we all know that, more than ever. But it was just saying, it was acknowledging that fact. It also acknowledges the fact that a lot of the changes that were happening were driven largely by digital technology, that globally now the world is a smaller place. We have greater connectivity, for better or for worse, and that there is now significant movement beyond traditional industry sectors. It doesn't matter what industry sector that you're in, for sure, the whole digital technology movement would have been a disruptor to that traditional industry sector, and the people and the organisations that an organisation would be collaborating or cooperating with would not be the type of industry or the type of company that one might have associated they would work with, say 5, 6, 7 years ago. Another factor that comes from the outside is the economic, environmental and social conditions within what we call the ecosystem. They've always been there, but the degree to which we've taken them seriously is another matter. Again, those of you that heard the discussion yesterday on the model with Russell, Yilmaz and Martin would have heard Yilmaz, when he was asked a question about what got him excited about the model, he talked about the transformation as the most important thing. His second preference, his second favourite, was to talk about the UN SDGs, but he did actually make the point they've always been there, but we've never taken them that seriously before. And that, in a way, is just summarising what this bullet point is about the economic, environmental and social conditions. Also, the recognition that taking an ecosystem view helps an organisation to make sense of the future and to get prepared for it, to brace itself for what's coming over the horizon. And you'll remember from the final slide I presented you a few minutes ago, we talked about the mega trends. That's very much what is happening outside the four walls of our organisation, and are we ready to deal with it? And then the final point that came out from the research from an outside-in perspective, perhaps in a way with links to the one about movement beyond traditional industry sectors, is to say that it is now about developing a culture in your organisation that is based on co-creation, a win-win scenario with others in your ecosystem to create sustainable value. So if we can go on to the next slide now, please. And this is the visual about a typical ecosystem picture. I just put this up here for a moment to emphasise the importance that EFQM places on encouraging organisations to get in touch with its ecosystem and to realise what it looks like. Now, I'm not expecting all of you to go away from this conference and replicate this picture. It's a picture we use for training purposes only. How you construct the visualization of your ecosystem is entirely up to you. We just use this for sort of teaching and training purposes because it illustrates the main points. So in your organization, and if you're looking for takeaways from this conference and you don't yet have a picture of your organization's ecosystem, you could do worse than starting with this picture and just say, okay, well, what's our organization's equivalent of the ecosystem? Do we understand the stakeholders? But in particular, do we understand what's happening in the market? And how do the different environmental sort of megatrends impact upon us? So I'd just like to, if you haven't done that exercise previously, I'd encourage you to do it. Okay, next slide, please. So then coming back to the research outcomes that guided the model changes, more of an internal focus now rather than the external of the previous slide. And coming back to the outcomes from the C-suite interviews, it was the challenge of managing the change and business operations in parallel, managing two sides of the same coin at the same time. And it was also recognised that there was a need for a mindset within an organisation for creativity, innovation and disruptive thinking to generate the increased value and improved levels of performance. And for those of you that are familiar with the 2013 model, you would quite rightly say to me, but that also talked about creativity and innovation, Geoff, and I wouldn't disagree with you. You're quite right. But what's different with this model now is an acknowledgement, whilst having a mindset for creativity and innovation is necessary, it is not sufficient. We also have to start to get our brains around and the culture of the organisation ready to deal with disruptive thinking. And I'll come back to that comment about disruptive thinking in the penultimate slide of this presentation. The need to be agile to respond to the opportunities and the threats that have come, typically nowadays more than ever, from new entrants into the market to digital disruption, and the need for a more collaborative style of leadership. It is less and less command and control, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in the subsequent slide. But basically, yes, let's just for the moment just say a different style of leadership, not command and control. And then the final point in terms of the outcomes that guided the changes is a different approach to working with employees, recognizing the value of a diverse population. I think we look around us now, especially those of us who have some years, to call it seniority or maturity, and have worked in a number of different organizations over the years. Whichever country you might come from, whichever country you're living in, when you look around you now, the chances are you have a much more segmented workforce. If we move on to the next slide, I'll just give you a couple of examples, please. So we need to recognise that the working population, for different reasons, is changing. And whatever was the old accepted norms, they are rapidly disappearing. And as an example, I can remember when I first started out on my career, my father said to me, what you need, son, is a job for life. And if you talk to anybody nowadays, you talk about a job for life, chances are they would laugh you out of the room. As a concept, it's long disappeared. And equally, and I think it's the true of other organisations, but certainly in the UK, the concept of retiring at 60 for women and 65 for men has pretty much disappeared out the window now, and periodically the government increase the ages for retirement. So you have a younger generation coming through at one end of the pipeline, but at the other end of the pipeline, the older generation are not leaving unless, in a way, they're pushed out the door for better or for worse. So it's about recognising that people's needs and what they get out of work is changing, and also that the population is more diverse than ever. Different people have different values in terms of work-life balance. I'm sure we've all read the articles which are based on research with the younger generations, where for them work-life balance is paramount, and working with an organisation that has a set of values that tune into their own individual beliefs. We talk about diversity inclusion, and we also talk about gender balance as well. So there's a whole range of stuff in terms of the world of today and the world of tomorrow from a people dimension perspective that we try to address within the model as well. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So I've talked you through the process we went through to get from A to B to where we are now. I've given you a quick flavour of the factors that came out of the research that influenced the design of the model and the sense of what was happening in the wider world. So now let's just look for a couple of minutes at the design concept of the model and the structure and 5 key themes that we talk about when we're presenting the new model to interested audiences. So next slide, please. So you can make this new model just like you could all the previous models. You can make them as complicated as you want. But the reality is, like its predecessors, this model is simple. It's based on 3 things: why, how, and what. So why does this organization exist? What purpose does it fulfill? And why this particular strategy? And those questions we cluster under the heading of direction. And then we ask a second question, which is about how. Okay, so you know why you exist, you know what your purpose is, you have a particular strategy. How are you going to execute this? How are you going to deliver on it? And of course, obviously, what we're all interested in is the performance, the results. What have you actually achieved to date? But also, especially in this newer model rather than its predecessors, but greater emphasis on the future. What does it intend to achieve to achieve tomorrow? So why, how, and what. Okay, next slide. And here's the picture of the model, which I'm sure you're all familiar with and you've seen several times already. Again, if some of you are familiar with the 2013 model, you'll allow me just to point out the fact that you will recall we had 3 visuals previously. We had a visual for the concepts, we had a visual for the model, and we had a visual for what we call the radar logic. As you will probably be aware, we no longer talk about the fundamental concepts, but we do still talk about the model and radar. And now, rather than having 2 separate visuals, we have the one that brings them together as a package. If we can go to the next slide, please. So the criteria of the model, of which there are 7, help you to understand what outstanding organisations do, what your own good practices are, and where you have the gaps. And then the radar logic helps you to identify how well you are working and where could you make the improvements. So again, unfortunately, with only 30 minutes, I don't have the time to dig deeply into the changes to the radar logic. But again, not only did the model change, the radar logic changed as well. Next slide, please. So the 5 key themes of the model, just to touch upon briefly. Number 1, culture. The EFQM model recognises that nurturing an outstanding organisational culture is how organisations manage and inspire their people to deliver on its purpose and create sustainable value. It melds belief, diversity, the environment, and the tone of the organisation. And for instance, one of the points we talked about a few slides ago was in terms of how you manage your people. Well, it's the people and the culture that, if you like, come together, and how you treat the people and the culture that you establish is what helps you to become an outstanding organisation. If you speak to any senior executives of any of the EFQM's award winners, or indeed any other leading organisations that ever been recognised as being very good, they will all tell you it's about the people. And the people and the culture is what makes the difference between being outstanding and possibly average. Next slide, please. Just quickly to revisit the subject of leadership, I mentioned earlier that we talked about a different type of leadership. And let me just now sort of expand upon that for a couple of minutes. In the new model, when it comes to leadership, we don't have an explicit criteria titled leadership as we did in the 2013 model. What came out of the research for the core team was having leadership at every level. So in other words, leadership was an activity, not a role. Of course, you still need your senior management team in terms of the planning, the budget and the strategy, but it's about engaging others in the organisation to support the decision making. So we talk about the fact that we need the leaders to keep the organisation true to its purpose and vision. And that comes out of not just what the senior managers might say in the organisation, but the fact that you have leaders in your organisation at every level who are tuned into that purpose, tuned into that vision, and understand the culture. So collectively, you're moving forward all in the same direction. So the key thing is less and less command and control, more and more, it's everybody's responsibility. Leaders at every level is the thinking, is the mindset. Next slide, please. And now we come again to the point that I'd already touched upon, managing two sides of the same coin. It came out of the C-suite interviews very strongly, as I've already mentioned. What was keeping them awake at night was, well, they had their daily operations, whatever they might be, to manage, to deal with, but equally they were tuned into what was coming over the horizon. They were aware of the need to manage not just change, but perhaps the transformation. And so how do you keep your eyes on both sides of the coin? How do you keep your eyes on the ball, both in terms of managing your daily operations, but also being ready to get ready to be fit for the future? So what we've endeavoured to do with this latest version of the model is to be very transparent about inviting organisations to assess themselves against how good they are in terms of transformation and performance, managing two sides of the same coin. And I think, again, coming back to the panel discussion yesterday, I think Russell touched upon that in the sense of in the past year when he's been talking to different people about the model, particularly the C-suite people that he meets. It is this aspect of the model that for them resonates most loudly. Okay, next slide, please. Next key theme is flexible and adaptive. So obviously no two organisations are alike. And it was interesting to hear Martin say in the panel discussion yesterday that when they first came to using the 2013 model, he found himself surrounded by people from the industry sectors rather than healthcare, etc. But they persisted, and they could see how the model would have value for them as well. So it doesn't matter what the background of the organisation is. No two organisations are the same, but the model is built to be flexible and adaptive for all types. It doesn't matter the size or sector, etc. So it has to be flexible. It has to be adaptive. It has to be fit for purpose to be able to help the organisation to manage disruptions. Next slide, please. And then one of the other significant changes I think I would suggest is the fact that whilst historically there has been an aspect of previous versions of the model that have talked about the future, now with this latest version of the model and indeed the associated radar logic, there is a greater focus on the future. So when you look through the model now and you look through the radar logic, you will see that we are talking about, and again we come back to the benefits of what the technology can offer you nowadays, the ability to process humongous amounts of data. We talk about predictive analysis. We talk about sentiment analysis. there is a whole new language around the digital transformations that are going on, which can help an organisation to tune into the future and to give it some early warning signals, both of threats, but also of opportunities. So, as I say, another key theme that we want to share with people is the fact that it's a future-focused model. It's not just looking in the rear-view mirror about what you've achieved and well done, although that is important. It's not either or, it's and both. It's the past and it's the future as well. Next slide, please. So, if you were word counting this presentation, I have no idea how many times you've heard me talk about change and transformation, but it is a fact of life that more and more now change is all pervasive, it is all around us. So what we think that the new model gives organisations and the leaders in those organisations is a framework that helps them to keep aligned to their purpose and vision, to help them to nurture the culture that they have and grow and develop it, to help it support the achievement of an outstanding performance, to encourage flexibility and innovation. What we haven't talked about too much, but is worth emphasising, is the importance of creating sustainable value for key stakeholders. The model itself and the points weighting, which we've not had the opportunity to talk about, when you look at the points weighting for the 7 different criteria in the model, you'll see that the criteria around creating sustainable value has the most points out of those 5 criteria in direction and execution. So we also talk about the importance of creating sustainable value. We're then maintaining performance whilst embracing transformation. We're back to my point about managing 2 sides of the same coin, and also managing the impact of external factors and the relationship with key stakeholders and other players in the ecosystem. So it's all well and good focusing on what's going on in the 4 walls of your organisation, but you also have to have one eye on the outside world. Tuning into your ecosystem is vital to understand what's going on, not just in the immediate boundaries, but beyond that. You know, which of the mega trends that are coming over the horizon that you need to be concerned about or offer you an opportunity? And for instance, how tuned in are you to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals? Which of those 17 goals are important for your organisation and you should be making a contribution to the achievement of? And then identifying how well the organisation is performing and identifying where strategically it needs to be even better. Okay, next slide, please. I touched upon this earlier on in terms of the change. There was an awful lot of desktop research done as part of this development of the model, but I just wanted to include this book here. If you haven't read it, I think it's well worth a read. And if you would not really a great book reader, but you like videos, you will see Salim Ismail on YouTube giving a number of different presentations based on this book. Well worth a read. And for me, the key thing here that I just want to sort of, as a parting comment, leave you with is to say, today, if you're not disrupting yourself, someone else is. Your fate is to be either the disruptor or the disrupted. There is no middle ground. And we believe that this latest version of the EFQM model is just the right management tool to help you deal with this future and to deal with managing 2 sides of the same coin. Next slide, please. I'm checking the time, and there was an opportunity for people to ask questions, but I will look to the director that's operating the slides for me. How does the new model measure agility in organisations? What would be the result of being agile? What are the benefits from ISO standards? So, okay, sort of 3 questions in one there. In terms of measuring agility in the organisation, that's where we use the radar logic as the tool to help us to assess how you would measure agility in organisation. And what would the result of being agile? Well, it's not about being agile for agile's sake. There has to be an end product, doesn't there? So you'd be looking in the results criteria, be it the perceptions of the stakeholders, criteria 6, or criteria 7, your performance in terms of strategic and operational performance. What was the purpose of the agility? Was it about speed to market, etc.? We come back to the rationale of the model in the terms of the why, the how, and the what. And when you dig into the model and the different criteria, you will see there are touch points, test points, where questions around agility are posed. The main benefits from ISO standards, I would just say they give you a platform from which you can build to make the next steps. And I think that is me now out of time. So thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. And I trust that the rest of the conference will be a big success for you. And I hope you've had at least one useful takeaway from this presentation. Thank you.